I want to pick up where Maxim stopped, actually. So I'm thankful for his contribution at the start of this session. He was talking about the value of IT risk management in frameworks and the value of frameworks as such. And the presentation I'm giving is about IT control systems, and risk management is a part of that, and how regulation, external regulation, affects IT control from the perspective of assemblage theory. So a little motivation. I keep this short because there's a lot to talk about in other areas. It's about the failure of IT control, basically. There are a lot of incidents in terms of when IT fails in enterprises, and I'm talking about institutional organizations. And we can find many reports showcasing those incidents. And those incidents are even more likely when you think about complex, large, rapidly growing companies, restructuring companies, and of course IT firms, IT-centric firms. So also banks, insurance companies I consider as firms which are IT firms, IT-centric firms nevertheless. And they have to struggle with IT control systems. From the consumer point of view, an example here, you could see that if you're a bank customer, you could see direct debit payments defaulting to a certain number, accounts being debited twice, and so forth. So there's a lot of problems, a lot of issues going on, ongoing, and actually increasing over time due to the role IT is playing, the increasing role IT is playing for those companies. One central point I want to make here is the rule of rules, basically, for those bigger enterprises. They have to comply with legal rules, external rules, and they're quite extensive. Also, internal rules can be extensive for those enterprises and others, and they have to be they have to fulfill contracts. A lot of rules. There's a set of rules, and businesses. My focus is on large ones, which are maybe listed at the stock exchange market. They have to comply with a huge set of external rules. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for example, GDPR, the newer one. Basel and solvency for insurance or reinsurance companies and banks, of course. Basel is for banks. So there's a lot going on in terms of regulation. It is very expensive for companies to attain a compliant state, and it's very expensive and difficult to keep the control system operational and remain compliant on a continuous basis. So this is the background in terms of the practical need that I try to position here. And the research direction is for this paper that I would like to understand how internal control emerges. So the point is on how it emerges, so how it comes into place over IT, so IT control systems in institutional organizations. And an important role also plays the history and the dynamics of the organization, the path of history, what happened in the years before, and what was arranged and put in place in the years before that affects what is going to happen now or in the future, and relating to those rules that I just mentioned. What are the difficulties in assessing and adapting the structures internally, and address those risks? So it's a risk motivated change, risk management motivated change that is happening. The challenge for this paper and for the presentation also is to introduce the assemblage perspective. The assemblage theory is something that has been developed around 30 years ago by Deleuze and Guattari. These are the guys with the original ideas, drawing on even older original ideas, and extensions have been made by DeLander, Collier, and Ong, and others. And those extensions took the original ideas into different ways. So it's not consistent what you find in assemblage theory. There's a lot of discrepancy and a lot of inconsistencies going on. But the main idea is that you view internal control systems, ICS term here, the abbreviation here, as something which is externally and internally motivated and driven, which is something that is adaptive, and it is a composite of very different things, and which are constantly changed, reconfigured. There's a lot of influence, social influence, and the borders, the contexts, the boundaries that change. They're not well defined in many cases. And you have many different parts that act together to yield emergent capacities, which cannot be reduced to its capacities. So the whole is the control system. This control system has unique capacities which emerge from interactions between its parts. And what the parts are in the properties of the parts, they are not in the properties of the whole. So the whole is giving us something unique that comes from the interaction of the parts. And I think that's the main message you could use with assemblage theory. And as I said, there's a lot of conceptual challenge in terms of applying that view to a hands-on situation. The hands-on situation is that we have a large Austrian company here with more than 5,000 employees. They wanted a SOX-compliant internal control system and keep it operational. And they are working with a very complex structure, IT-wise, data-wise, system-wise, many different systems, very complex, restructuring all the time. So you can imagine it's a very difficult situation to introduce an effective IT control system. What we did 2 internal control assessment cycles following an action research approach. Those cycles, they had a time in between to change what we wanted to do and then reapply the same thing again, basically. A mixed qualitative and quantitative data analysis was happening. And the data collection took place over around 12 weeks with a break and then another 7 weeks roughly. 2 research cycles with a lot of field contacts in different ways, from interviews to briefings to meetings to workshops and so forth. I don't want to go into detail there. I think that's quite boring, all in the paper. And let me focus on the findings. So the results, the main results. The first slide here shows components of an IT control system, just a selection of components. But I wanted to get across here that those components, those parts are, as said, heterogeneous, that they're very different in terms of what they are and what they can do, the roles that they basically take can be more material or more expressive. So there's an axis between materiality and expressivity that is happening. That's also one main criterion of assemblages, this axis. So material means what the resources basically, in expressivity, and expression means what you showcase, what you show, what you do. So when you present yourself basically. And those components, they interact. So if you take something off that list, let's say a user developed application, it is developed by people. It is there's risks attached to it. You have owners. You have it is used in the process. You have process owners. You have IT controls. That's the last point. The IT general controls that safeguard the development of those systems. So everything is connected in some way. They interact with each other, and for that interaction, the capacity of control actually emerges. Yeah? This is the main thing, that through interaction, something new, a new capacity emerges, and that's the function of IT control, you could say. But how is this then put into place? Well, and this is also another aspect of assemblages, that you have processes, mechanisms that need to be actualized in order to gain those capacities. So I looked at harmonization as one range and qualification as the second range of processes. What you take away from that slide is that you have a time scale. So it's always the assemblage, the control assemblage, as I can call it now, is always shifting over time. So you have a certain imprint. That's the top of the first mountain here. That's the imprint. A control system territories is imprinted, but it is only at this point of time that the assemblage has this identity, and it changes again one moment later into something else. And you go through a recursive, very similar cycle of activities again. So it's always contested that what is in place. If you look at those processes, harmonization processes, for example, harmonization, that's the first part. In practice, you talk about scoping. That's the word that consultants use. They scope. Scoping means actually boundary setting, territorialization. So the territory is defined. What is in, what is out, and that's not always clearly defined. There's a certain fuzziness to defining those borders. So the level is the territorialization. You could say that's the fuzziness of the border, basically, of the control system. And then you design, you code the controls. So that's called codification in assemblage theory words. And this is all done guided by global standards, like those frameworks that Maxime has just presented. This is a standard is used to guide, to mediate that process, basically. And then what comes after that is the measurement. And Maxime also mentioned that those frameworks they lack in terms of what they prescribe in terms of measurement. So there's a methodological zone, a measurement zone that has to be fully defined for the enterprise. That's a huge effort. And then it is qualified what is being done. So qualification means how well do the processes work. The outcome would then be the effectiveness of control, basically. So this is the qualification part. And then you have a certain imprint, the identity of the assemblage. And the assemblage seems stable, almost stable to a certain level, but then it's destabilized again by the next processes. And this is called deterritorialization with opposing opinions and forces. So that is, it's very fluid what is happening here. Even if you see a certain report and an attestation of compliance, it changes from the negative. There's always activity in the system. Control activities are always happening. So I see a lot of framework mediated institutional arrangements through harmonization. So that's one clear finding, that the frameworks are important. They mediate what's happening, at least in this case. Yeah. The global framework also belongs to the assemblage. It's part of the assemblage, but itself, it has no value. Just looking at the framework itself has no value for the company. It cannot be instantiated directly. Only through interacting with the other parts of the assemblage, you gain value, but also conflicts, ongoing struggles. So there's an uneasy relationship with frameworks. I think this I can also confirm from this case. I call it abstract global variables. So it's an abstract global variable which interacts with local variables, which gets overwritten or changed by the local situation. There's some research that I mentioned here that I seek to extend. Qualification, the second part, a key aspect here is that legitimacy is developed there, and it can be very low of control. So the perceived legitimacy of control can be low in places. If this happens, you see a lot of partial or incomplete or circumvented control in the qualification part. And deterritorialization, so things are getting moved out of the assemblage again, or in again. It depends in which direction it's going. It goes. In this case, out. So controls are taken out, systems are taken out if they cannot be fully controlled.
Edward, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. That's fine. I'm almost finished. The installed base is that the sum of history. The installed base is the legacy problem. The legacy problem is also evident here. It's called installed base. So what to do with those systems in terms of control. And finally, that's my last content slide that I wanted to emphasize. I could emphasize a lot. These are the exteriorized relations, because I think this is overlooked in classic traditionalized research a lot. You have components in the assemblage, but those components can have relations with other components outside of the assemblage, and that affects them, their own identity and their own form, and this again affects the assemblage. And there are a lot of interesting conclusions that you can take through those exteriorized relations. Okay, my summary slide is here. So what I'm looking at here is I'm viewing IT control through an assemblage lens, and I think there are a lot of benefits that you can take from that perspective. I listed a few of those insights. The explanations are there. I think you can explain well and maybe achieve and help developing those control systems through those explanations. What you have to say is that assemblages are harmonized and qualified in assemblage words, and they change a lot over time due to the forces I just mentioned, but there are also many others, political forces also, that you can take into those frameworks. Standards mediate internal control emergence as part of the framework. And you have many ideas that are interesting that you could extend, like the idea of emergent properties, irreducibility, the exteriorized relations that I just mentioned, affecting territorialization and qualification. Okay, so sorry for the speedy presentation. That's the end of it. It's a bit hard to present this topic because there are so many aspects that you could potentially present. It was also challenging to write the paper in this regard, but I hope I got my main message across.
So thank you, Edward. You have been very pretty